Policy without organization, without coordination, gets you little or nowhere. And that's sort of my philosophy, my worldview of politics, and the art of politics being the art of the possible over my career, in trying to build and put together organizations that carry out the policy. Let me give you a couple examples. When I was and Jeff Miller, we appreciate what you're going to do, but you might take a little advice from me. When you get there, even though you're in the minority, you can have a huge impact if you're organized. I became chairman of the Republican Study Committee back when I was a sophomore in the House, backbencher. We had big government leadership in the Republican Party, in the form of Bob Michael, and you know, they would just go along to get along and get their little crumbs off the table with the Democrat majority, and they would be good guys and friends with the Democrats. Yet we decided that we were not going to play ball anymore, and that we were going to do whatever we could to get the majority back. So as chairman of the Republican Study Committee, I organized these little things called action teams. There's only 5 or 6 members that would meet on a weekly basis around a particular project. One of the most famous projects that we worked on was stopping George Bush from breaking his pledge, Bush 41, from breaking his pledge and raising taxes. We took 6 months. Dick Army was sort of the lead on that, but we did the organization and the grunt work, if you will, of meeting every week in an action-oriented, that little action team, and we would strategize how we were going to stop him, number one, from negotiating with the Democrats and raising taxes, and then when he did it, how we were going to defeat him. Make a long story short, backbenching conservative Republicans defeated Bush on the first vote in the House of Representatives on raising taxes. Now the problem was, he had to have a bill, so he went back in the room, bought off enough Democrats to pass the bill, and ultimately became law, but he lost his presidency. We tried to tell him, this is your opportunity. These crazy right-wingers stopped it, and you can now back off of your pledge, breaking your pledge, and you can do something different. He didn't, and he sort of suffered the consequences of it. But those kinds of organizations, putting together organizations, what, if I have any talent, political talent, is what I do. Well, so when I left Congress, I started looking at the left and doing a lot of research on the left. When I was in business, I always paid attention to my competitors, make sure I knew my competitors better than they knew themselves, so I could build my company. But what happened was, I hooked up with David Horowitz. He had found out, after about 3 months of my own research, I found out he had a website called discoverthenetworks.org that he had spent $1 million in research on the left. And it's an incredible website. You ought to go to it. It'll give you a real feel for what they were able to do. And then I ran into this liberal journalist by the name of Matt Bai, who wrote a book called The Argument, which verified everything that David Horowitz had written in his book, Shadow Party, from the left's perspective. Well, what they did, ladies and gentlemen, is they didn't leave Washington when they left the White House in 2001. The John Podesta's, the Harold Icke's, the Morton Halperin's, Jim Jordan, all those guys, they started working. They were hungry. They were out of the White House. The Republicans controlled Congress. They were completely on the outs, and people were talking in terms of a long-term, permanent majority, the Republican majority. And so they started working, and they did the same thing I did. They researched the left and what kind of movement they had, and then started building organizations to fill the voids as they perceived them in the movement, and they created a real movement. A movement is when people come together and work together and coordinate with each other and work on projects and issues and drive a legislative agenda and drive it, in this case, a leftist agenda. They were very cool about it. First of all, it took them 2 years to convince donors to coordinate their giving. And of course, they had a big champion in George Soros. MoveOn.org was already, most of you know the history of MoveOn.org. It was formed after Bill Clinton was impeached, and basically built on, let's push the impeachment behind us and move on. And they were getting more and more powerful. But everybody blames this coalition on MoveOn.org. MoveOn.org is just a piece of the overall coalition. And what they were able to do is they needed a think tank. They had no think tanks to amount to anything. So they created the Center for American Progress, which is now one of the most powerful think tanks in Washington, D.C. They can hold a national meeting and get tens of thousands of people to come to their meeting. And they organize and coordinate. They needed a media operation, so they created a media fund, which was like an advertising agency that does all the ads for everybody, graphics and stuff like that. They needed a politically strategic communications operation. So they created Media Matters, which is like a mad dog operation. Mark Larson probably has gotten some hits from Media Matters. They're constantly holding conservative media people accountable. Well, they lie about it, but they got a blog and they go after them and they don't say anything. They even follow me around. I'm out of Congress. And I go on Mark Larson's show, and the next day there's a whole blog with a transcript about how I lied, cheated, and stole on his program. And it's a very sophisticated operation. And now they're so big, they've now got state chapters of Media Matters, and they're incredibly well organized. They needed grassroots organizations, so and it's no longer around, but they've changed it. They created a group called Americans Coming Together, which at one point in time had over 1,400 full-time employees, many of them ex-cons, where they would go get cons coming out of prison and hire them to canvass neighborhoods at their little palm pots and stuff. And American Votes, which is a grassroots organization. And I'm just touching the surface. You can go to the websites and get the books and go to my website and others to find out exactly. They created many organizations that had grassroots, think tanks, communications operations. They even created some groups like the FBI. I call it, one group is called CREW. All this corruption stuff comes out of this opposition research group called CREW, where they go and actually investigate conservatives and see what they can do to criminalize those conservatives. I'm the recipient, John Doodle's recipient, and many others, of the kinds of investigations that they have been doing to create this notion that conservatives are corrupt people. But it's a very sophisticated, well-funded operation that's all hooked up. They're in 2 buildings in Washington, D.C. One is at 17th and L. The other is they've taken over the rest of the building of the Motion Picture Association, and they office together. So they're constantly, on a daily basis, coordinating with each other. Now, why is this important? Well, let me tell you why this is important. Yeah, the Republicans may have shot themselves in the foot in 2006, but if they didn't have this political coalition, I don't think they would have ever taken the majority. Because what they did, because of wonderful McCain-Feingold campaign finance, so-called reform, they were able to go into congressional districts and Senate campaigns and set up full-blown shadow campaigns, totally separate from the official campaign, totally separate from the Democrat Party. I give us an example, Richard Pombo, right here in California. Full committee chairman of the Natural Resources Committee, sitting in a good, maybe not the best, but a good Republican seat. They came in 18 months out from the election, set up shop. They made this coalition, NAREL, Sierra Club, all these leftist organizations that are single-issue organizations, The other organizations